Hello, and you're very welcome to the Music As podcast series. I'm Louise O'Connor, a fiddle player from Clare, and this is a series where I chat to different people about the role music plays in their lives, joining the dots between music and lots of other areas. You can follow Music As Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and now on YouTube. And please subscribe and share the podcast if you enjoy it. Thank you to Creative Ireland Clare and Clare County Council for sponsorship of this episode. I'm delighted to welcome my guest today, Matthew Noone, an Australian-Irish ex-indie rocker, composer, music lecturer and performer of the 25-stringed instrument called the sarod. Matthew tells me about his journey to India, his process of apprenticeship in Indian classical music, and how he found his way to a deep immersion in Irish traditional music in East Clare. Matthew has had a rich and diverse career, collaborating with Steve Cooney, Lisa Hannigan and Jiggy, to name but a few. He's also written his PhD on Irish-Indian musical sympathies, which included a trip to India with Martin Hayes and Dennis Cahill, which is documented in a beautiful short film by Miles O'Reilly called The Sound of a Country. He's released 2 albums as part of Antara with renowned percussionist Tommy Hayes, where they explore the space between Irish traditional and Indian classical music. I really enjoyed chatting to Matthew about the elusive draíocht or magic, the feeling that goes into music and the otherworldly places that it can take you. Matthew also pays a lovely tribute to Tony McMahon, a man deeply in touch with the draíocht who sadly passed away shortly before this interview. Matthew's most recent solo album, The Other Side of Knowing, was described by Folk Radio UK as defying genre with roots in Indian classical music, electronic influences and exploratory production technique. It's traditional yet experimental, meditative yet unsettling. You can find links to all Matthew's music and to his Patreon on matthewnoone.com. I open the interview now with a clip from Morning, the opening track from The Other Side of Knowing. Hi Matthew, how are you doing down there in East Clare?
Doing great, thanks.
You're down in Faha, isn't it?
Faha, County Clare, yep.
The famous Faha. It comes into your music quite a bit, doesn't it? That land itself.
Yeah, very much so, yeah. And actually, I don't know if you know, his name's going to escape me, but there's a great book called This Is Happiness by Niall.
Yes, I have read that actually.
Yeah. And that's set in a fictional town in West Clare called Faha. And the whole book the whole story is very much about rain. The opening 3 pages is about rain in Faha.
Yes.
And I wrote a tune called Faha Rain, but it was about this Faha actually. Yeah, so there's several Fahas, but I think they're all just one Faha.
Okay. So, Matthew, you were born in Australia, is that right?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah. And you made your way over to Ireland. You took a roundabout way to getting to Ireland, didn't you? Could you tell me a little bit about what drew you to move into Ireland?
To Faha, County Clare. Well, my dad is Irish, so my dad was born in Dublin actually, but his family, the Noones, are from Galway, Mayo actually. So it's always had a real important part in my psyche, and I always sort of felt out of place in Australia. I actually always never felt like I really belonged in Australia. And I still feel that way. And in fact, I kind of always felt that European people, like us white people, didn't belong in Australia. And I kind of still feel that way. I didn't realize that when I sort of left Australia and started traveling, went to India, for example. But I think now, as looking back, I realized that I didn't feel my sense of identity there, and felt that Australia wasn't my home. And I was always really quite sensitive to the fact that European culture has been really implanted upon Australian soil. And Australia is a beautiful place. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm not complaining about it, but it's beautiful and wild. But it always kind of felt like, for me, like, we shouldn't be here, this culture shouldn't be. And I always felt there literally is no roots in the culture. It's 200 years old. White Australian culture is 200 years old, which is nothing, And I always really felt that, and felt, I don't know who I am in this. This isn't where I'm from, So, yeah, a big part of coming back to Ireland was, trying to figure out where I was from. I didn't realize that until, when I left Australia in my early 20s. I haven't lived in Australia since I was about 25, I think. And I went to India. India was the first port of call when I was trying to figure out where I belonged and who I was and all that sort of carry on. And at the end of that experience of trying to try and understand who I was and where I belonged, going to India for many, many years, in the end, I had this sense of, no, really, it's Ireland that I need to go back to. I wanted to have some roots, so Ireland was the place that I felt like I wanted to put my roots down. So that's why I came, I guess, and why I'm still here.
Lovely. And part of your searching and your exploration and travel experiences, music was a huge part of that, wasn't it? Yeah,
it was. Well, it wasn't actually the main impetus for my first trip to India. I actually was really, really involved in Zen Buddhism in Australia, when I was living outside Sydney, in the Blue Mountains outside Sydney. And I actually had given up music for a couple of years. I was a guitar player before that, and used to play sort of rock music, or indie rock, they might call it, post rock, they might call it these days. But then I got into Zen, and I'm a bit obsessive by nature. So I sort of, when I get into something, I tend to just do that. So I got into Zen. And I gave up music for a few years, but I really got into the chanting, and I used to be one of the chant leaders in my sangha. And one of those chants we used to do all the time, it mentions the historical places of the Buddha. It's like where the Buddha was born, where he was enlightened, where he first taught, and where he died. And so my first trip to India was actually, that was kind of the main reason, was to something of a pilgrimage. And I didn't really go with the idea to learn music. But when I got to India, and I went to Bodh Gaya the first time. So the idea was to go for 6 months and just meditate and become enlightened. And I went to Bodh Gaya, which is where the Buddha is supposed to have been enlightened. And there's a big Bodhi tree there, and thousands and thousands of Buddhist pilgrims from all around the world and India. And I went to this Korean Zen temple, thinking, okay, I'm going to just meditate here all day and become a very good Zen student. And I ended up having an argument with the head monk, because I brought this little flute and was playing it in my room, and he got really annoyed at me one night, saying, "You can't play flute in the temple." And I got really pissed off at him. I was like, "What do you mean you can't play?" He was like, "No, we don't have music in here." And that made me really quit. I was not really enjoying my time, being a Zen, being so austere and meditating all the time. And I don't feel very good if I don't play music for any length of time, And I think for that period of years, I'd been ignoring music. And so, when I had this argument with the monk, I was like, how could you have a spiritual practice that wasn't musical, So I was like, I left, and then I ended up sort of changing the direction of my trip, and decided I was going to try and learn some Indian music if I could.
So that's when you started the sarod.
Yeah, that's when I started. I started learning the sarod. Yeah, I went to Benares and Varanasi. I actually met a Spanish guy who was playing sarod. The first time I ever saw sarod was some Spanish guy who'd been learning for maybe 2 or 3 years, and he could play a little bit. And I was like, wow, this is a cool instrument. And yeah, he introduced me to his teacher, and I started learning from his teacher, whose name was Rajit Singh. In Benares. So I learned with him for just about a month. I wasn't like, I was enjoying it, but I wasn't like fully obsessed by it. And then I went to Calcutta, and in Calcutta I met a lot of other foreigners who'd been studying Indian music for quite some time, for 5 years or 10 years or even more. And through that community, I got introduced to my teacher, Sagata Roy Chowdhury. Once I met him, actually, that was he was the gateway for me to really getting into the music, and he really opened the doors for me and encouraged me to sort of take it seriously.
There's very much a model of apprenticeship, isn't there, in India classical music? You find your teacher, and you returned to the same teacher like over and over, didn't you?
Yeah. It's called, they call it the Guru Shisha Parampara. Yeah, I mean, it's the only way to learn the music, really, is this apprenticeship, because it's an oral tradition. It's not notated or written down, and you have to just sit. They say you sit with your teacher. You sit with your teacher, and yeah, my experience was that actually, it took me years to realize it, but some of the most important teaching was not actually with the instrument, was not even playing music. It was when I had to really stop. I had to try to stop thinking about the learning process in a sort of Western framework of like, I have my lesson, I go home, I practice, I come back, and he gives me something else, and I practice that, and then I get better, and then eventually, because that was actually causing a lot of conflict, for me, and I think for him initially in the first few years. And then when I just sort of, there's an element in that relationship with the guru and the shisha where you have to surrender. Actually, it's a similar model of a relationship to that classical yoga sort of spiritual guru, where you surrender to the guru. Although it's not a religious or spiritual, explicitly spiritual relationship in the same way, but it has that same quality. And I guess after a while you realize that it's quite a struggle I found it quite a struggle to hold to surrender to a mortal man, who is just a few years older than me, and just surrender to whatever he told me to do. And that's kind of really hard for the ego to do that. I realized it wasn't necessarily about revering him. It's what's behind the teacher. Like it's that world that he's giving you access to, that his guru gave him access to. And that's the thing that I learned. I can revere that and treat that as something deeper.
That kind of lineage, like.
Well, the lineage, but also beyond the lineage is this access to musical experience, which is divine, is the only word I'd put on it. This access to experiencing musical sound as something that's transcendent and transformative.
It's really interesting to me, like the crossover between your experience of music in India, and I studied yoga in India, and also study music as well, and just that whole thing of like trying to get out of your mind and out of your thinking and kind of just come into your body a bit more. I think there's huge overlap in those kind of apprenticeships of learning in both fields. And there was something your teacher said I really liked, that you tune the mind, and then you tune your heart, and then you tune your instruments.
Yeah.
And I really liked that. I think it's not always the approach to playing, which can be quite kind of competitive driven growing up. So if you grow up in that competitive world of music, it can be the opposite in ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I was lucky in a way. Even before I got to playing Indian music, I was never in that competitive world of music. Like that's what I like about rock and roll and punk and electronic music, that it's quite egalitarian. And I was always drawn to music that was about expression and that felt free. Yeah, Indian classical music really has like that dissolution of the ego, because it is music is seen as a spiritual practice, and it is is connected to yoga and the as a practice, as a spiritual practice. So it's just so much entwined with the musical practice that, yeah, it's so powerful.
It's like music is in like the yoga philosophy, like the world is understood as being made of vibration, being made of sound, isn't it?
Right.
So
yeah,
that's a really all-encompassing approach to music, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in the theory of this.
Yeah.
My teacher Sridhar is he's a nada yogi, which is nada means sound, so sound yoga. That's his main practice actually is nada yoga, which is an explicit spiritual practice. It's not a musical performance practice. From what I understand, the basis is that the basis of nada yoga is that the whole world is made up of sound. Like constantly vibrating, and that our bodies are made up of sounds. And there's a very explicit meditation practice about meditating upon the sound of each chakra and singing that sound internally. Actually, that's a big part of, from what I understand, is a big part of the spiritual practice of nada yoga, is internally singing and tuning the body, I guess, to the different resonances of the energy centers in the body. And the music, Indian classical music, has that philosophy built into it. Most musicians wouldn't explicitly be aware of it or consciously talk about it, but the music has that built into it. Theory. It's like a theory built into the practice that you can learn the music without being able to talk about nada yoga or chakras, because the ragas themselves and the pitch material that you use in the ragas are explicitly chosen to evoke certain feelings within the body, and to evoke certain states of being, different rasas, different sentiments, different flavor. When you get to know certain ragas, like I actually recognize the feeling in my body of that raga. Sometimes when I'm playing or practicing, it's like, well, yeah, I feel that feeling, and then it's a familiar feeling that I felt before when I've heard it or I've played it myself. It's amazing how much of an effect. It's amazing how much of an effect music can have on us in general, on our bodies, and not just our bodies in a physical sense, but in a sort of holistic sense.
Yeah, I think the Indian classical music, it's a lovely framework for reflecting on that, on the embodied experience of music, I think. And I suppose, like growing up with Irish traditional music, I would never have had that explicitly, like I would feel it, but I've never had it explicitly really expressed. I'd never really heard it explicitly expressed. I was just reading, I know Tony McMahon was a huge influence on you, and I was just kind of went into a bit of a dive into some of his writing this week, and he had really beautiful things to say about music and the transcendent and emotional parts of it. And I was reading how he was doing kitchen concerts with Steve Cooney, and they were doing, he'd ask the people to close their eyes and just feel into the message of the music, and to meditate on the music and to experience in a spiritual way, like that's what he said, like to rather than kind of a clap hands entertainment kind of way. And that's just a whole other layer of depth to it that is also intrinsically there as well, isn't it? But it's just it's not always spoken of or spelled out, I suppose. But that was really lovely to read, because it resonated so much with with other kind of practices that try to achieve that same thing, I suppose. So.
Well, Tony was really in touch with that other world that I was referring to, like with gurus, and of course, he spent a lot of time in India. In fact, I first met Tony in Bangalore in 2014, and he's gone to India every year for many, many years. And not only do I think Tony's always been really in touch with that world in his experience with traditional music, and he was also really in touch with a generation of musicians, Willie Clancy and Joe Ryan, and all these great Clare musicians, Paddy Canny and P.J. Hayes, and that whole era of traditional music was a really different. Those musicians, and they might not have explicitly talked about it or eloquently or systematically described it, but they all were really in touch with that magical world of that music can transport you to. And Tony was really connected to that, and he understood that it wasn't just traditional music as well. He was a great listener of all kinds of music. I know he loved Indian classical music. He just loved music. And I actually remember meeting him in Ennis at a concert once, and it was one of these big gala concerts that seems to happen in traditional music, where it's like everyone plays and it's like 3 hours long and everyone plays their 3 tunes, and it could be some 10-year-old kids and it could be some well-known musicians, and I went up to Tony to say hello and to chat to him, and there was some teenage kids on stage. I didn't know who they were, and they were playing, and he was sitting there, eyes closed, and I was like, "Oh, hi Tony, how are you?" And he was like, "Hang on a second, no, let's talk after the music's finished. Like, we should listen now." I was like, "Oh, okay." I was like, "Wow, this man, no matter what, no matter where, he respected music and really valued it." So he was a great man in the way that he unapologetically, embraced that. It's almost like a way of being in the world, more than just thinking of yourself as a musician.
You described in your writing, and I know other people have written about this, the idea of the lonesome touch, like the
Right.
playing in that kind of melancholic, like lyrical style of playing, and also being associated with living in a particular way as well, like in like having a calm, relaxed personality that goes with that, which is the dream, really, for those things to go together, to live. And I guess it's the same in yoga. Like it's not about stretching is 5% of it, it's about trying to live in a good way, I really liked that kind of connection, that kind of crossover to living your life in a musical way.
My favorite word that traditional musicians use is draíocht, the magic. And a lot of fiddle players and a lot of musicians in East Clare would use that description to describe music, the draíocht. I was a bit obsessed by that when I started learning traditional music. I was like, okay, what's the draíocht? Like how do you bring that out? That's kind of for me, that's what the PhD was about. It wasn't really trying to learn tunes, and it wasn't even about trying to establish that there's some historical connection between Irish and Indian music, because I'm not really interested in that, actually. What I was really interested in, was there's a shared sympathy, which is not just Irish and Indian music, but I think all music actually has this. All music, I think, has, all musical practices in the world, around the world, have at their core an understanding that music is magic, that you can access something beyond the ordinary consciousness, through sound. And so I was always interested in trying to understand what that was within Irish music, partly because, going back to my sense of trying to know who I was and where I was from, because I had that sense of that I had to learn Irish music because it was the closest thing I had to something that felt like it was, my culture or my lineage. So the draíocht, the magic that the musicians talked about, Yeah, I think from my understanding, yeah, you hear it in fiddle playing and in piping. I think a lot of it is, and it's like it's a looseness, and yeah, it's like untempered scale and a sort of a slowish rhythm. And I think I mean Martin Hayes talks about this far more eloquently than me, but I remember actually being at a workshop with Martin. He was talking about this, the feeling. He often uses the word feeling to describe that thing, that music makes in us, and I think he describes it really well. He just talks about play a tune like you really love it, like just really loving a melody, not just like, and that's why I think people actually get one thing wrong about traditional music. This is my humble opinion as an Australian guy who plays an Indian instrument. That actually I don't think it's rhythmic. People think Irish music is rhythmic. I think actually it's melodic. It's so melodic. Like the melodies are so beautiful and so sweet. And I think the older generation of musicians really understood that. They love the melodies. They love the tunes, and they play them like they love them. And they're simple tunes, right? They're not very complicated. And most older musicians didn't have that many tunes. So they played the same ones again and again, and they learned to love them. A bit like this idea of the raga being a being. These tunes were like, oh, I love that C natural in that tune. It's like, oh, so when I play it, I'm going to really love that C natural. I'm going to scoop into it and like accentuate it. Or that tiny ornament, that's like that attention and love to a melody. I think that's what the draíocht was that love of the melody and sort of allowing yourself to get lost, get lost in music.
I suppose like accessing that world of feeling. Like I've heard Martin Hayes talk about that as well. For example, like the playing of like Tommy Potts, he was talking about, the emotion in his music and the style of playing, and you have to, he was saying you need to spend time with that, but it's worth it. It's like that apprenticeship idea of like that could be with one tune, that you just spend time with one tune that Tommy plays or something like that. And that apprenticeship model, like you did that as part of your PhD as well, didn't you? You were kind of apprenticed yourself to various people.
Yeah, well, I did. Yeah, and that was that was actually part of my methodology. Like I spelt that out. Yeah. Like I realized, because my research was practice-based, it was arts practice. I wanted to learn Irish music on the Sarod as a practice-based exploration of Indian and Irish musical sympathies. Rather than, I could have done it purely academically and read and musically analyzed them, but I felt like, well, that wouldn't really serve much purpose,
Yeah. Way more fun to do a tour of India.
Yeah, exactly. So because that was the way I learned Indian music, and from my little bit of research into traditional music, I realized that was a really important part of traditional music, was this apprenticeship, and I apprenticed myself to Steve Cooney, who often I apprenticed myself to people who were a bit marginal, like myself, like musicians who were connected with traditional music, but also maybe had their foot in another world. So someone like Steve Cooney is a great example of that. But also musicians who really, weren't afraid to express music as something that was, sacred, I guess. Yeah. So Steve was one, and Martin Hayes, of course. I mean, he was a big influence to me to play Irish music. He became a dear friend as well. And then even when I took up the fiddle for a few years, and I was learning from Jed Foley, who's a musician based in East Clare, fabulous fiddle player. So I learned a lot of my tunes from him on the fiddle. I mean, very badly. I don't really play anymore, but I think East Clare has heaved a sigh of relief when I put down my fiddle. But so Jed and Steve, John Carty is another musician. I don't know if you know John Carty's music, but it's exquisite. I love his music. And yeah, and then also I apprenticed myself to, in a similar way to how in Indian music you understand your gurus being not just your physical teachers in your room, but also the lineage, So for me, I sort of apprenticed myself to musicians who are dead, in the Irish tradition. So particularly Junior Crehan, I fell in love with his tunes, which are just magic. I mean, literally magic. I think his tunes, if you play them, I think it's a bit like, a Beatles record. If you play it a certain amount of times, magic actually happens. Junior Korean tunes are like that. They're just these little paths to fairyland. They're amazing.
Yeah. I was talking to Mairead Ní Bhainnig about how musicians in Donegal, like Mickey Doherty, for example, used to say that he took tunes, the fairies gave him tunes. And I know that Junior Crehan used to say the same thing. Like, and it's just,
it's true. I'm sure he did. I'm sure he did. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It was, Mairead was describing it as like just this other world that you go to get your creativity, kind of was how she described that kind of process, which I thought was lovely.
Yeah. I mean, it's the language that traditional musicians have, and musicians now have the closest, the most acceptable language we have to describe that in Ireland, I think, is, the fairies, or the puka, or, but in India, it's like that music comes from Saraswati, like the goddess of music, or it comes from your guru, or it comes from, your guru's guru, who's dead 5 generations, but it's the same idea. It's the same idea, just a different language for it.
Yeah. Or I guess Mairead was saying as well, it's like a connection to nature, to your environment as well. Like it's like they took, the story of they took a walk and the trees spoke to them and gave them this tune, like, so it's that kind of like receptive relationship with your environment as well, like, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not just the environment too. I think it's also wildness. It's like, like nature, but not in a sense of, oh, aren't trees nice? Or it's like the almost the power and the possible violence of nature. That wildness. Because there's real power in that. And and the fairies obviously dance in that world. So very much, that's part of. But that's really what helped me get into playing traditional music, because I learned tunes. I tried learning tunes before, like from O'Neill's 1001. It was like, but they're just dead, like that. These aren't living to me, And I can imagine if you grow up learning tunes that way and just go to your classes and you learn them and you go to your competition, it would be hard to have a real grow for the music, But that for me, that real love came through, particularly through Junior Crehan's music, and then really connecting him with Clare itself, and the land here, and the stories of the older musicians, and the sense of I really like to know where tunes come from, the story around them, and often the name of them, or knowing the locality, particularly where it's come from. I think that's all really important, and it sort of feeds the playing of the tune as well.
Yeah, that has all really fed into like your collaboration with Tommy Hayes as well, and Tara, and your solo work recently, like your solo album, The Other Side of Knowing. That was bringing in all those aspects, wasn't it? Like it was born out of the place where you were and the time you were in.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think, I still love playing tunes, and like even for myself, sometimes I just play tunes just for enjoyment. But when I play with, when I play with Tommy, or even when I do solo stuff now, I guess now I'm at a place where I'm kind of lucky. I don't really have to think about what I play. I don't have to think about whether I'm going to play Indian music, whether I'm going to play Irish music, or I used to kind of get a bit worried about it. Was I playing Indian music? Was I playing Irish music? Was I playing either of them correctly, or was I appropriating both of them, or did I have a right to do that? I guess now, after living here for a few years, and the process of the PhD was part of that process of sort of accepting who I was and the mixture of my interests. But I think there's something about feeling rooted in the locality in Ireland, and then also in this region, not just Clare as such, but like really this region, like the Draíochties here, this mountain range here, and this valley that I'm in, this particular region. I think for me, that's been the real grounding aspect. It's like, well, I don't need to worry about whether I'm Irish or Indian or Australian or what kind of music I'm playing, but I'm playing my own music, but it's from here in this moment in time, and this experience of me being here. And yeah, so like with Tommy now, it's not really, we play a lot of pieces that are my own compositions or his compositions, and sometimes we just improvise, we just make up stuff, and it's not traditional, or it's not Irish, or it's not Indian even really. And my solo stuff is going more that way towards improvisation, but improvisation without it being tied to a particular form, a particular cultural form. But for me, it's all still like, it's all kind of traditional music in that sense that it's music from this locality. It just happens to be music from this locality played by an Australian guy playing an Indian instrument, but I kind of still see it as traditional music in a way. Yeah.
It's a lot to do with you and Tommy's relationship as well, like, and what that's like its own entity in the music too. That kind of back and forth between you. So.
Yeah, we've become such good friends over we've almost been playing together 10 years now. And yeah, it used to be like, okay, we'll play an Irish tune, then we'll play an Indian tune and put them together. And just over the course of years, I think we're both at a phase in our life where we also don't really care anymore about trying to do anything in particular. And we're both lucky enough that we're also lucky that we're not trying to make a living from our music full time, So when we get together, it's purely for the joy of it, And I know Tommy also, believes in the magical power of music, or the transformative power of music. And so I think we both really are really grateful just having that relationship that we have, that we can get together and we don't need to rehearse or plan or think about anything, and we just really are able to connect through music, and it's a really special relationship to have, when you develop that sort of connection with someone. And Tommy's great too, he's like, I mean, he's such a musician, like he's a percussionist, but his sense of musicality is just so subtle and deep, It's such a pleasure to play with him. So yeah, it always feels like a real it always just feels like a real honor to be able to play music with him, actually. Like Tony as well, he's also very rooted, but also has a real global perspective. And I know he loves Arabic drumming, he loves jazz, he just loves music, I think that's when you meet musicians like that who just love music, and just are really grounded in their place and in themselves, but also really their mind is really open, then that's really, really nice to meet those kind of musicians. Yeah.
Lovely. Well, Matthew, it's been absolutely lovely to talk to you about your experiences in music. Can you tell people where they can hear your music or follow you?
Oh yeah, I guess like on the internet. I have a website, matthewnoone.com, and I have stuff up in Bandcamp, and gigging around the place with Tommy, and hopefully in the spring I'm actually thinking about I'm halfway through making a ukulele album at the moment. So I'm hopefully going to release that in the spring and see if I can do a solo tour in the spring, maybe. Yeah.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thanks a million, Matthew.
Thanks. Yeah. Nice to chat with you as well.
Thank you for listening to the Music As podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's interview. You can follow the podcast at Music As Podcast on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and now on YouTube also. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the podcast if you enjoy it. See you next time.